You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner and you're listening to Mark the Maker. This is episode 113 of the show, and we have a guest and a very interesting thing to talk about. We'll get to that in just a second. We don't have our full panel today. Sean's hung up, so he's not able to join us. We have Mr. Michael Birch.
Here.
And we have Mr. Tom Crine.
Hey, guys.
I was hoping to catch him with a mouthful of noodles.
Mm-hmm. But they're not done yet.
Oh, they got to just soak for a while.
Yeah. They're probably really hot right now.
Our listeners are well aware of the Tom's Eat During the Show tradition.
Yeah.
Pickings are slim in the shop today. I need to buy groceries. I'm down to ramen, honey bun, and Doritos.
Ramen, honey bun, and Doritos. That's rough.
Yeah, and grape Kool-Aid.
Grape Kool-Aid. Lord. This is like Lord of the Flies, run by a bunch of 11-year-olds or whatever.
I feel like Harper went shopping for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I get the little stuff you add to water, and the Kool-Aid stuff is the best. And it's cheaper.
Yeah.
But the cherry's my favorite.
Okay. Michael, why don't you?
Yeah, let's get on to the advertisers. We want to thank AMXINC.com, American Not Metal Exchange, Metal Exchange. George over there, he's been our longest standing advertiser, and we appreciate him greatly. All your Zerk and your titanium and exotic funky stuff. A lot of damn steel. He's been posting a lot of that stuff up. I've been dabbling in some real small screws, so I've got to get a hold of him for some zirconium rod when I get a chance. Free shipping, all that fun stuff. We appreciate him greatly. It's AMXINC.com.
So today I talked to our friend Jim Worth from Giant Mouse Knives, and he was on his way home. It was a crazy day today. They released their latest Giant Mouse knife, the GM11 and the GMP11. P means, when you see the P, that's the decoder, right? When you see the P in the name, that means the pirate version. So it gets a special logo, it gets dark wash, that kind of stuff. So the GMP version only ever has 200 knives, and the GM11, they have 400 knives in the runs, and they sold almost everything today. So they were very busy. There's a handful of the GM11s left. They might not be. I'm going to guess they probably won't be by the time this comes out, but they sure look cool. So go check them out. You can find them at giantmouse.com, or you can just look up Giant Mouse on Instagram and find them there. So thanks to our friends there at Giant Mouse for helping us out. They have a knife called the Biblio XL that was a recent release in their sort of standard lineup, and they're getting great reviews on it. It's a very Giant Mouse design. How cool is that, right? They've been around long enough now, and those guys' design language is distinctive enough that it looks like a giant mouse. So
yeah, was that the one with the very Anzo-ish inlay? A lot of circles.
No, I'm seeing this as just a solid handle, but it's I don't know exactly what I would call this kind of shape. It's sort of like almost like a hawksbill with a little bit of belly, sheep's foot with a little bit of belly to it, sort of. Good looking knife, yeah, Spyderco.
Michael, you're talking about the GMP11 that he talked about at first.
Oh, the new one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one.
I really thought that was pretty cool for production. A lot of cool inlay stuff there.
Yes.
And it is sold out.
The regular ones are sold out too?
No, there's still a few of those left.
Yes. I see what you're saying, Michael. Super Anzo looking handle design, bronze inlay, the whole deal, right? He's done a couple different things like that. So yeah, the pirate version sold out. The regular GM11 is still showing on the website, but good looking knives. So check them out. Thanks to our friends Giant Mouse Knives for their support.
Yeah, thank you guys. And we also want to thank our Patreon supporters. You guys have helped keep this show alive by, allowing us to be able to pay to ship the mics back and forth and around and stuff like that. You can find us on patreon.com. You just search for Mark of the Maker and our thing will pull up. Basically a monthly type of fee, and it helps immensely. And we want to thank you all so much that have supported the show and keep it going. Keeps the lights on for us.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Thanks, everybody.
Sounds like they're coming for you, Michael. You might want
Yeah. All
Appreciate you guys.
Tom, you got one? Wrap us up.
Yeah, so I want to give a shout out to Bob Terrazuola. His website is terrazuola.net, and he's got something really cool that he's coming out with next month. And this month, Shop Talk is available, and both of these things are really cool. Basically, Bob, who is not a spring chicken, is using like cutting edge technology to be available to his customers and Patreons. With Shop Talk, you get to do Zoom calls. He's going to do some videos every month that are going to be available only to them. There's some swag. I'm going to subscribe myself. I really recommend you guys do it. Sharp Life is next month. It's going to be available, but Shop Talk is now. It's really not that much for what you get, the access. This is access to a world-class knife maker and a really good guy. Fun guy. I'd also recommend checking out their website. He's got some pretty cool stuff on there as far as swag. He's got some pretty cool enamel pins and patches and stuff like that. So yeah, if you don't have his tactical folding knife book, I would highly recommend purchasing that. It's very inexpensive. Who knows when it'll go out of print again. And it's all updated with new information. And it's well worth $35. If you don't have it, you should. So yeah, check it out. Bob and Suze are great friends and really some of the best people in the world. So feel good about supporting them.
Yeah, really cool. Don't take the availability of the book for granted.
No.
It was out of print for a long time and really hard to find, got expensive and all that crazy stuff.
Yeah, they were $300-$400. And this is a better version, updated version. So I would highly recommend it.
All right. Well, let's get our guest introduced. So we have recovering Mark of the Maker guest, author of a couple of interesting books, one of which we're going to talk about. I think we talked about the other one previously. Yeah, I think he's joined us twice before. He's going to correct me if I got that wrong for sure. And
no, that's right.
YouTube sensation, Dr. Laren Thomas.
Yeah, Mr.
Back by popular demand.
What's up, man?
Shuffles onto the stage. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of expensive books, writing this book, The Story of Knife Steel, I'm plugging the book, not wasting a single second. I was reliant on lots of historical sources, magazine articles, books, and there are so many books on history. They do like tiny print runs, like 500 books or something.
Yeah.
They all sell, and then those books are just left on eBay for hundreds of dollars. And I had to buy so many of these, and I didn't always know if it was going to be the book that I really wanted. Like there's 30 books on Randall, right?
Yeah.
And some of them are just like the tiny changes in liner material or something. Like I don't need that. I need to know the straight skinny on like the history of Randall made knives and what steels they were using.
Right.
Luckily, I bought the right one. There were great quotes from Bo Randall, the man, and they talked all about the steel, forging it, which catalogs they were getting, all the details that I want. But man, that was a lot of work just finding those books and buying them for less than $500.
No doubt.
You should have just drove down and spent a minute in my library.
Probably.
The Crinebury.
Yeah.
So yeah, Laren's got a new book. Is it new? Not that new now, right, Laren? It's been out for some months.
Yeah, it came out in May.
Okay.
And I contacted you guys and said, you're going to love this book. You guys love history. You talk about it all the time.
Yep.
Let's do an interview right away. And you said, that is a great idea, Laren. We'll do that right away.
And here we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To be fair, this is pretty right away for us.
Yeah. This is very on brand, just to be.
We're still working on mugs.
Yeah, right.
I
sore
will
spots
say,
left and right.
As soon as you told us about it, I went out and purchased the book. So
Same.
I've
thank
had
you.
it and been looking at it and playing with it and reading it. And
Yeah.
I told my wife I'm ready to go to the beach because I've got my reading material.
Yeah. All right. The Story of Knife Steel, Innovators Behind Modern Damascus and Super Steels. That's the full title, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So I know you've been on some other shows and talking about it a bunch since we failed to have you on immediately, but for people who haven't heard any of that stuff or don't have the book, which they're doing it wrong if they don't have it. Also, if you go to knifesteelnerds.com and hit the link at the top that says Story of Knife Steel Book, Laren has a plethora of links on ways you can get this book. So it's easy peasy in many, many countries.
Well, and I'm just going to throw this out there. For a lot of you guys, a thick book on knife steel probably sounds like great bedtime reading material. It's not. It's actually pretty cool.
It is cool.
There's so much custom maker information in here. This is like,
Yeah.
it's awesome. Like if you're interested in the history of knives or steel, it's just awesome. There's so many knife makers mentioned in here and their stories. And I mean, it's all here. It's a really crazily well done. I wouldn't expect anything else, but yeah.
I mean, I might have made a mistake by calling it The Story of Knife Steel because, like you said, it really is an introduction also to the knife industry in modern-ish times, around 1900 and forward. How did we get to this point, where we've got all these custom knives, these high-end production companies? Where did they come from? And you can sort of piece it together through magazine articles and stuff, but there's not really any one place that just lays this all out for you. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to do, because it's boring or there's a lot of backstory missing if you just say like, oh, Bob Loveless introduced 154 CM. It's like, okay, who cares? Who was Bob Loveless? Why was he significant enough to introduce this steel and it becomes very popular? That's because Bob Loveless was very popular. And so, I was worried like, oh, am I going to be talking about a bunch of obscure knife makers I can't get very much information on? And mostly the answer is no, because the influential guys were the ones who were influencing knife steel.
Yeah.
And so I can write about the most influential figures. But speaking of the big names, almost any name mentioned in the book, even if he's mentioned one time in one sentence, there could be a whole book written about that man or woman.
Yeah.
So I almost guarantee it. So even people, for me, I'll just be like, writing about somebody and make an offhand comment and like, this man helped him learn to make knives. I'm like, oh, I've never heard of him. Then later down the line, I'm writing about something else. I'm like, oh, this was the guy that did this and this and this and this and this and this.
Exactly. So it's kind of interesting. There's a ton of information, right? Just truckloads of information in the book and a whole bunch of stuff in the quotes from makers and all kinds of cool stuff. One of the things I got to say that I love that's in there are the steel advertisements.
Yeah, man.
Those are so cool.
Ask how he got those and how
Yeah.
it was.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that part because I spent hours and hours. So this book became an obsession for me. I did not think the book would sell well, but the more I thought about it, the more I had to write it. And the more I worked on it, the more I had to finish it. And I remember being up at 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. So I went to the bathroom, so I don't wake up my wife. And I'm on my iPad. I'm just like, oh, I think I just figured out where I can go find this. If I just use this Google term instead. So this book is not just about knife makers and knife companies, though it is a lot about that. It's also about metallurgists and the steel companies that they develop for.
Yep.
And you wouldn't think they'd have advertisements for steels. Why would they have an advertisement for
Right.
D2 in 1928? Who would they even advertise to?
Right.
But there are these old trade journals, for metallurgists, for engineers, for machinists.
Oh, yeah.
And they would put ads in there. And finding them was horrible because these are very obscure trade journals and they're only really available at like universities. So Google Books has this amazing search feature where you can search for something. We'll say Chromovan, the original name of D2. Finding that it was Chromovan, also very difficult. We'll get to that in a second. And it'll tell you, oh, that's in Machinery, volume 37, number 2 on, in between these pages. And I'm like, great. How do I get those pages? And it's like, go to Carnegie Mellon University and go to the stacks. And like, well, I'm not a student at Carnegie Mellon University.
Yeah.
So I found some online sources, and the fact that we're in this year is the only reason I could write this book, because there's a couple websites. One of them is archive.org, the web archive.
Yeah.
And they allow you to check out things for like an hour at a time that you would not have access to any other way. Their search is horrible, but Google Books search was pretty good. And then I could go to archive.org and find the journal and find the page. And then I'd find these amazing ads. Like, they're so cool. These like vintage designed ads.
Yep.
But yeah, you would think, like, when I first started doing Knife Steel Nerds, I would write an article on D2, let's say. And at the beginning, I'd be like, oh, I'll just give a short history of D2. So I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to type in D2 history on Google here, the Google machine, and it'll tell me where D2 came from.
Right.
And I say in the intro, like, the first thing that comes up with D2 history, most deals you type in 01 history, nothing comes up. Nobody knows anything. D2, it did have a page from some yahoos that didn't know anything, and they said, like, oh, D2 became popular in the Rosie the Riveter days of World War II. No, it didn't. It came out like 10, 15 years before that. And the steels didn't come out as their designation. These designations, A2, D2, 440C, a committee came together and they said, these are the popular steels. We're going to assign them these designations and say what the range of composition needs to be. They had already been out for 5, 10, 15, 30, 50 years. And so you can't just type in 440C into Google Books and you find an ad for 440C. No, the ad is not for 440C.
Right.
The ad is for whatever the trade name was. So you have to track down the trade name. So anyway, this is getting long-winded, but this is how difficult the finding of all this information. I couldn't find, there's no book on tool steel or stainless steel history I could just go rip off for the book.
Right.
90% of it is original. So
yeah.
So what was the process of like being able to use those pictures? That's because some of those
like
make some
legally?
great. Yeah.
Oh, I just didn't ask.
That's more of a screenshot.
I mean, they're out of print. The companies that printed them are long gone.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it is fair use. Like, you can pull things out of old publications within reason. Now, when there's photos of knives and stuff like that, obviously I had to get permission for all of those.
Oh, yeah.
But somebody can come after me for using Machinery Volume 37, number 2 from 1938 if they really want to, like, take me to court.
Right.
But I got to use that sweet ad. So
I think
some of those make some great posters, though.
Oh, yeah.
Those are cool.
Yeah, if you could get a good scan, right? That'd be pretty fantastic to decorate your shop with a bunch of
I did
steel posters.
early on in the book, I did find it very interesting. The whole Silver Steel E.C. Atkins story.
Yeah.
Nothing is new under the sun.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, literally, he's like, I'm making this special steel and it's the best steel ever. And that's why you should buy my saw. It's awesome. It's same kind of stuff is going on today still. And
If there's any consistent thread through knife steel advertising, it's that when they say that they have a special steel, it's probably not special.
Revolutionary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like, oh, we have a special formulation no one else has. Most likely, that is false.
Right.
So they're buying a steel off the shelf and calling it under some brand.
Yeah.
And this continues to this day. I could list them off, but it would make them all mad. So I won't.
Right.
that sounds fun.
I think you mentioned the the various names earlier, and that's a really interesting piece of this as well. That was one of the things I stuck in my notes. Just there's a section at the very end, the last chapter, the family tree of knife steel, that I absolutely love because it puts it in very easy to comprehend visual layout, right? With explanations. It's fantastic, right? So chapter 44 on page 462, family tree of knife steel. I love that. And it's like, man, I don't know how you would do it, but it would be really awesome to have the same kind of thing for the names, right? Just like the trade names and how they wire to the industry standardized names that, oh, by the way, changed along the way as well, right? Depending on, I would assume in some cases, who used the material, right? Like, okay, SAE puts a designation on something, but there were a bunch of other groups, or I don't know. Like the people, like you said, committee, right? A committee gets together and says, okay, we're going to call these steels certain things based on their names. And
yeah,
it certainly wasn't a standardized thing, or at least it didn't seem like it based on the way stuff was named.
Yeah, well, one of the random things that would have been impossible for me to discover without the internet being available and all the scans of these journal articles is I found when they broke out 440 steels into 440 A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And I found it on like page 937 of some random trade journal. It's like, oh, by the way, we changed this, in some year. I don't remember, like the late 30s.
Yeah, the fall meeting of whoever that got together.
But the family tree of knife steel, that was one of the driving forces of the book originally. I was like, oh, I can explain where steels come from, because when people look at steels, the average consumer, they don't recognize that steels are similar to each other. And I try to explain it like, oh, this steel is barely different than this one. Like, you're asking me, oh, this one's amazing according to this company. And I'm like, it's exactly the same as this, but they can't see it. But there's a clear progression of composition that happened from all these metallurgists developing new steels. They would take an existing popular steel and change it in some way, and it became a new thing. And I was like, well, this would be a great way to explain to people how things evolved, to talk about steel history. And I'm like, oh, but no one will understand the evolution unless I give a little bit of backstory and explanation. So I'm like, okay, I'll do like 2, maybe 3 articles on my website to explain the history. And then I started writing, and I'm like, oh no, this is going to be more like 5 or 6 articles. And then it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And then I got sidetracked, and I was like, I'm just going to do the history of Damascus. I had done the history of powder steel in Damascus. I'm like, I'm just going to fill this out more. I'm going to interview all my dad's old Damascus buddies, and I'm going to get the whole history of Damascus patterning and steel use and stuff. It's going to be great. And I didn't even know what I was going to do with it. It would be one of the now 7 or 8 articles on steel history for my website. And then I ended up with 12 chapters worth of stuff. And I'm like, great, now I've got these 12 chapters. What am I going to do with them? And so anyway, it kept getting bigger and bigger until I had to start cutting things down to fit it into 500 pages with a bunch of pictures.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? I mean, so it just kind of snowballed. That's kind of how this really came together, was just like a project that kind of got legs and couldn't stop.
Got out of hand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I had like 2 or 3 like early chapters, some of the stuff on like where steel first started developing. And then I had these 12 chapters on Damascus, and I'm like, I've just got loosely connected things now. And so I really sat down and said, okay, here's the outline, and then broke that down, and here's the chapters that we have to have. And of course, then there's some evolution as you write things like, oh, this needs to be split into 2 chapters, that kind of stuff. But anyway, at that point, I had to get more organized and figured out like, okay, what is this project going to be? It's not what I initially thought it was going to be. What does it need to be? And it just didn't work as 2 or 3 articles on my website anymore.
Yeah, that was one of the things as I was going through reading. At first, I was like, I don't know if the way he ordered this makes sense to people. You know what I mean? Like at first, I'm like, I don't know. And then kind of once you get in the swing of don't worry about the timeline, follow the story and the info, you know what I mean? Then it's like, okay, I get it, right? It's kind of I don't know, your time machining around, it feels like a little bit, right? It's not like a direct timeline. At least it didn't feel like it.
Yeah, there's a loose timeline to the book, but some stuff has to be given out of order.
Yeah.
And it just has to be. So there's a mixture of timeline and thematic writing.
There you go. Yep.
You know, because like you won't learn certain things about Camillus or Schrade until much later. You know, but you can't like stop the story like, oh, nope, we're only going up to 1905 in this chapter.
Right.
You know, so that's the mixture. But, you know, I had to introduce things one at a time. So like, you know, we write about the knife companies using carbon steels early on because I've introduced carbon steels.
Right.
You know, but then to talk about the alloy steels they were using, I got to introduce alloy steels and where they came from and
Right.
and on it goes. And then we introduce knife makers and Bill Moran, and then we take, you know, 11 chapters on Damascus right after that.
Yeah.
You know, so and then we get into the high-end knife companies and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. When that thought struck me, right? Like, I don't know, the order seems maybe unusual. Then I spent a bunch of time staring at the contents and I'm like, yeah, I don't know how else I would do it. Right.
Yeah. I don't think there's any way.
Yeah.
Did you have any help with the research, like a research team at all, or is it all you? Because
research team, I'm a one-man research team.
One man research machine.
Because there is a lot of it.
Man, no kidding. Yeah. One of the things that I thought was interesting, there's lots of interesting stuff, but one of them is around patenting and what appears to be a much less robust early patent process, or I don't know. It seems like stuff got patented and then people made it anyway in spite of a patent is what it felt like in some cases, or, you know, we're kind of waiting on the doorstep for the patent to run out. And then, like you said, they would either tweak it a tiny bit, just enough to be something different, or so that they could rebrand it, or not change it at all and just rebrand it and sell it anyway.
Yeah, there's so many examples that are coming to mind. I don't even know where to start. But like, I'll give a couple. So high-speed steel, and I think it might even be chapter 1, includes the invention of high-speed steel.
Yeah.
But high-speed steel was half discovery, half invention. You know, they were messing around with heat treating. This hard-nosed, like, factory leader guy is mad at his veteran machinists all the time because they want to run the machine slow so the tools don't overheat and lose their temper, right? They soften if you run them too fast. And so he's always arguing with the machinists like, oh, you guys can run these faster. And they're like, no, we can't. You'll see. And so he says, well, I'll show you. And he goes and he makes a table. So like every machining operation, he figures out how fast it can be done without overheating the tool. And he makes this giant table. Well, then he's like, okay, now I'm going to see if I can get him faster by trying different steels. And he tries different steels and he finds the best one. And so he brings all of the like higher ups at the company. He's like, come see this. We found the best steel to use. And they do the demonstration. And the steel that they chose did worse than any of the other ones.
Right. Yeah.
And so he goes to the blacksmiths who heat treated the tools. And he's like, what the heck happened? Why'd you overheat my tools? You made me look like a fool in front of everybody. And they're like, no, man, we took special pains to make sure we didn't overheat them. So he and a metallurgist, this was at Bethlehem Steel, they were like, okay, we're going to throw all convention out the window and we are going to heat the steel up to every temperature, from black all the way up to just under melting before we quench it. And then we're going to see how the tools do. And they found that the hotter it went, the better the steel did. And this was a high tungsten steel. And so the tungsten and moly are always in high amounts in high-speed steels because when the steel heats up, like during tempering, all these tiny moly and tungsten carbides precipitate and it makes the steel harder, not softer. And this was high-speed steel. So they patent their discovery, but the patent gets rescinded because the steel they used was pre-existing. They didn't invent the steel. They discovered a new way of heat treating it, which wasn't patentable.
Yeah.
So that's story number 1. Story number 2, Paul Richard Kuhnrich. So he did not invent D2, but he did everything but invent D2. He was a crazy German guy who immigrated to Britain, and he developed D3 tool steel, which was a precursor to D2, and also D5, which looks very similar to D2 with cobalt. And you would think like, oh, cobalt, that's crazy. It must have come after D2. No, D2 was a copy of D5. Just they removed the cobalt and made it D2. So this guy, he was very interesting. He was a pioneer of chromium steels, and he also started a razor company using his high chromium steel. High chromium steel was a new, novel thing. No one was making it.
Yeah.
And so he invented steels, and he made razors and other types of cutlery. So he's the perfect combo, interesting character. Plus, then we're getting into World War II and stuff, and also World War I. And so no one trusts him in Britain because he's a German, and so lots of interesting things from this guy. But he would patent lots of things in Germany or Britain, and then American metallurgists would just copy it and make it because it wasn't patented in America. So anyway, that was lots of talking from me, so I will allow other questions and discussion.
Well, I mean, my question is, he was making razors out of D2?
Well, out of D5, which is basically D2 with cobalt. And D5 also saw some use in like the late 70s, early 80s in custom knives. And he would advertise them as like rustless razors. And then some of them rusted some, and he said, well, the edges are rustless, so because they're polished.
It's just interesting because most people think D2 takes a crappy edge and holds it forever.
Yeah. Yeah, so,
But they're making razors out of them.
Yeah, they made razors really early on. And this is way before, most people say stainless razors, they came like in the 60s. These were in the 20s.
Yeah.
So the history is way more complicated than you've been told. And even prior to the 60s, they tried making Gillette razors in stainless in the 30s, and they were failures. So they were using a very high carbon stainless, and the microstructure was too coarse. Speaking of D2 taking a crappy edge and holding it forever. And
well, I would never choose D2 as a razor steel because of its large carbides and the toothiness. It makes a great hunting knife, but it's interesting that they were making razors.
Yeah, apparently they made it work. So the corrosion resistance was definitely a factor. This was early days where stainless steel was invented after this guy was already making chromium steels. In fact, at one point he accused people of taking his ideas with chromium steels to develop stainless steel, which in the end he kind of rescinded that argument. Is basically independent. But yeah, so I don't remember where I was going. Oh, so Gillette failed in the 30s with stainlesses, and then it wasn't until later that Uddeholm and Sandvik made finer microstructure stainless steels, and then they really blew up in the 60s.
Side note, I do shave with a Gillette safety razor.
Nice.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That was interesting. Thank you, Tom.
Yep.
Okay, good.
We know you're trying to put a little push for D2 in there, and
yeah.
kind of turned
No,
back
I just find it interesting. I would not choose D2 as a razor steel due to the large grain structure in it.
I mean, they obviously didn't work out too well for them because they didn't continue doing it.
Right.
I mean, it sounds like it worked out pretty well.
No.
Well, in the end, he went bankrupt and he shot himself.
Oh.
Oh, that couldn't have worked out better for us.
Yeah, maybe not so good. All right. Well, we'll
A
revisit.
twist I did not see coming.
We'll revisit Tom's personal hygiene in episode 114. So tune in next time for that. So on this idea of patent thievery or copying or whatever, right? I mean, it's
Borrowing.
But borrowing, yeah, creative borrowing. I have to imagine in the research, you came across numerous conflicting historical accounts about stuff, right? Mm-hmm. This world seems rife with that. Maybe do you have any examples of really interesting ones?
I've got a great story on this one.
Okay.
So every steel company says we developed this new steel. And I'd be like, oh, great, I found the company that developed the steel I was looking for. I finally found who made A2. And then I'd be searching around for other things, and I'd find a company that says, we made this new steel, and I'd find the composition, and it's also A2, and it's 2 years before the other company. And this happened constantly. I always thought I had the oldest version, and then I would find one that was older. And so, yeah, this was frequently difficult. And eventually I found some telltale signs for, which companies actually developed things so I could be more confident. In a few cases, like, okay, this is the earliest one I found, but I'm not 100% sure. One trick I used is I found lists of equivalent grades from like the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So I'd look at A2 and I've got a whole list of trade names. And so I would just start Googling those in like the old trade journals and stuff and just sort by date, like which one shows up first,
Yeah.
And that's how I had to narrow down some of them. But a fun story. Okay, so T15 high-speed steel. It was the highest vanadium high-speed steel for a long time. It came out in like the late 40s, I think, 1940s. And so Vasco, it's a company in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which still sort of exists under the umbrella of a bigger corporation.
Yeah.
And so they said, our guy, James P. Gill, he developed this steel in the 40s. Then I was looking through old lists of German high-speed steels, and I found T15 before it came out from Vasco. Then I found a government report of steel in Germany that came out right after World War II. And they showed steels that were in use before World War II and after World War II. So it was like, I don't know how you get invited into these German steel companies in the midst of a war, but apparently they did it. And so in these lists, given to the U.S. government, there were steels that looked like T15. And the person who headed the research team on finding the German steels was James P. Gill of Vasco. So obviously he found the steel in Germany and then copied it. I don't know if he said he lied and said this was his, or just, the company, they don't care. They're like, oh yeah, Jim Gill, he developed that. So, write down on there that Jim Gill developed that. So some of it is misinformation. Some of it's because companies just always advertise there first. And sometimes there's funny cases of copying. Now, the world is a much smaller place. You can't get away with those things as easily, though I guess people still make claims regardless. But,
stop people.
Yeah, German steel could be more of a silo versus American steel, more so than can happen today.
No, that's really interesting. I think it goes to marketing of literally anything, right? Mm-hmm. You got to have a great story. And I think maybe in that first episode that you did with us, you said something like that, right? Something about a good product with a strong claim, right? Or a good slogan or whatever, right? And that seemingly any consumer product is that way, right? Lots of people, eat this breakfast cereal. This is the healthiest, or tastes the best, or makes your life better, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. It's all wrapped up in that same kind of marketing scheme.
So how was some of that composition, quote unquote, borrowed or known? What was the composition like advertised, or was it in the trade books? How would they, or was it just like people talking from different factories? Or, how would you know that so-and-so is doing a certain steel and this is what was in it at that time?
Yeah, well, early on, the compositions were not advertised.
Yeah.
So you would only buy steel on brand name. And when committees started getting together and trying to come up with specifications for steels, a lot of the steel companies pushed back because they would say, no, I don't want people buying D2. I want people to buy Firth Sterling Chromovan, and that they know our brand Chromovan is the one that they want. And, they would say, because there's more that goes into it than just the composition. We make the steel in a little bit different way that makes it a little bit better. And the end customer knows that they're getting a more consistent product from us buying Chromovan. And so there was some of that pushback. And because some stuff wasn't patented or they don't want copying, a lot of things were just advertised under the brand. Like, this is our high-speed steel, go buy this steel. Or this is our oil hardening die steel, buy our steel. So in the early stuff, a lot of times I could not find compositions until later. So I might find a brand name advertised in 1890, 1905, 1910, but then I can't see the composition until 1936 when it was more regularly published. And so in some cases, you have to make some leaps. Like, okay, did this composition change between 1905 and 1936? And sometimes you can find evidence that there was, or that there were small tweaks, or, like they had the original, but then over time, as more people made copies, it kind of coalesced into what became the specification. But other companies, they could copy because they could use methods to measure the composition. So, you have your competition, you go out and you obtain some dies or other tools that have the steel in it, and then they just measured them. And I found this in high-speed steel. So high-speed steel, it developed extremely rapidly. So I talked about the Foreman guy, and they discovered high-speed steel, and they had a certain composition. Well, that composition radically changed within only a few years. The competition was really fierce early on, and everyone's copying each other. Everyone's trying different things, reducing the carbon, increasing the tungsten, etc. And they all coalesced on something pretty quickly within just a few years. It was extremely rapid. And one of the things in there showing the rapid change is there was a guy, John A. Matthews at Crucible Steel, and they had measurements like, okay, we got 6 competitor steels in 1902, and then we got 6 competitor steels in 1903, and look at how radically they had changed. He was writing about this like in 1919 or 1930. And so, yeah, there was a lot of measuring the competition's steels, lots of copying, especially in areas that couldn't be patented or weren't patented. So I can tell one story about, so in the knife world also, there's lots of claims about people who were first. The first to use D2, the first to use 440C. And so if you find a Blade Magazine, a Knife Magazine article that says this person did this first, chances are decent that they were not the first. And so one example I found is I would read about the early Schrade Loveless collaboration knife. And that is called the first custom collaboration knife. It came out in 1975. Then I found claims that Blackie Collins did the first collaboration knives with Smith & Wesson in 1971. And then I was writing about Gil Hibben, and he designed knives for Browning in 1968. And I didn't find anywhere where anyone called Gil Hibben the first collaboration knife. Now, I'll give you my opinion on the first collaboration knife. I think it was the Schrade Loveless in 1975 because it was advertised as a Loveless knife. That's the point of a collaboration, not just the design, but that you advertise the custom maker along with it. Blackie Collins designed a series of knives for Smith & Wesson. Gil Hibben designed a line of knives for Browning. They found custom knife makers. They said, design our knives. It's just it's just contract work. They don't care. Yeah. They just need someone who knows about knives.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's my opinion.
Well, yeah, it wasn't used as a selling point, and that makes a difference. It's a cool knife, too.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Right. Collaboration versus, like Laren said, contract work, basically, right?
Yeah. And we said, there's a ton of cool promotional stuff, but the pictures of the knives, I mean, there's so many great photos in this, and that appeals to me. I'm a visual person. I like reading, but man, if I have something to see, I enjoy that greatly.
Yeah, that was actually a tough decision. I wanted a lot of pictures in the book, but printing in color is more expensive. So I had a 500-page book, and I wanted color pictures on almost every other page.
Right, yeah.
So that jacked up the price of my book, and Amazon pricing is really weird. So I set an MSRP, and then they price it wherever they want.
Yeah.
I think they're making $0 on the paperback edition of my book.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they do that. Oh, I also have a PDF. So Mark mentioned links on my website. The PDF is the cheapest way to get it. So if you've got a nice big iPad, that's a decent way of reading it. Then the paperback is a little bit more than the PDF. And then the hardcover is pretty pricey. It's a 500-page hardcover with color pictures. The hardcover is definitely the one you want, but it's also by far the most expensive.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was a hardcover.
Ah, yeah.
But being a book nerd, as we all of us here are, obviously, it's like a hardcover is the business. It looks
The
good.
business.
It feels good. I love a good hardcover.
Oh, yeah. The hardcover also has a little bit higher quality printing. So this is a print-on-demand book.
Ah,
And so they have two, like, quality levels.
yeah.
And the one used in the hardcover is a higher quality level. So the contrast and colors are better. So this is how we can avoid doing a 500 print run that sells out and skyrockets to thousands of dollars.
Right, right.
It's just the way you have to do things these days. Now, if someone from whoever is publishing for Blade now wants to publish it, then we can talk. But for now, I think this is probably the best way to handle it.
Hit me up, he said.
Just added a hardcover to my cart.
I think we talked about this in a previous episode because I think I bragged on the fact that I had the hardcover, Tom. Just to grind your gears.
Well, I'll have both.
Well, I'll show you, pal. You know what? You know that the first is a great one, Laren. You know what really ground Tom's gears when we did these history mini-sodes, because just like in your book, right? Like there's information out there, but maybe not like an hour and a half long, 2-hour episode on a maker. It's just maybe not enough info, but there's makers you want to talk about. So we busted up into 4 pieces. We each pick someone and then spend, somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes telling about whatever history we could find. And I did D.E. Henry, and he's written up as having many, many firsts. And I rattled off that list, and Tom was like, "Oh, bullshit! Nope, nah, no way." It was absolutely comical going through the D.E. Henry list, which makes me wish D.E. Henry was still around to talk to Tom about that. But
I was the first to grind a knife right-handed at 36 inches off the ground.
Yeah, there was
on
some
a
very specific firsts.
14.3-inch wheel.
yeah, first maker to flat grind.
Retard.
Yeah, he had a whole list of steels that he said he used first, including D2 and 440C.
Yep.
Bob Lovelace said that he had used D2 several years before, but didn't like it. Gil Hibben, he has always said that he used 440C first. Now, there wasn't as much communication between makers back then. We can get into A.G. Russell and the Guild in a second. And so some of it, like, if some guy in a shop somewhere used 440C in a knife, then technically he was the first person to use it, but
Right.
like no one knew about it. Also, Randall, he used a couple different 440 variants back in like the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out who the first person was. And so in some sections of my book, like I'll write about 440C and D2 and I'll be like, okay, Lovelace said he used it in this year. D. Henry said he was the first to use it in this year. Jimmy Lyle said he was the first to use it in this year. And Chubby Husky said he was the first to use it in this year. And, so like they may be off by years,
Right.
or exaggerating the story or whatever. So, I can't make a determination. So like here's the people that said they used it first. Here's the years they said they used it. And here's the citations for all of their claims kind of thing.
Right.
Speaking on that stainless steel Randall, why did it not have a handle in the picture? Was it just a test knife? Were they, just being like, let's do this? And
the picture I remember seeing, they called it a fish knife, and it had a handle, but it was a steel handle.
Oh, I thought it was just like...
I'm looking at page 116, Randall's first stainless knife in 1938. And so Randall, he paid a guy to forge his knives, especially in the early years. So this guy, Al Marchand, who had like a local machining and forging shop, he did a lot of the early Randall stuff. He helped develop these things, develop the methods, did the heat treating. He was extremely important to Randall. And I think you miss this in some just like generic histories of knife makers, like the guys that helped the guy.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they were trying out stainless. They're given some what I guess would be round bar. They were given a round bar of stainless, and they had to do something. So he forges out that round bar into a handle, and then he forges out a flat to make the blade. And then they're like, oh, well, this is a fishing knife, so it's all one piece of stainless, so nowhere for corrosion. You know, that kind of justification.
Looks like they forged it into a railroad tie.
Yeah, it does kind of look like that.
Nail.
I see that now.
A spike, and then
Yeah, I noticed that in a number of the quoted sections, Laren, that timeline discontinuity, right? Where there were makers who would say, oh, I was doing this and there were only a couple other guys, and they would rattle off names. And then, you know, there would be somebody else who said, you know, it was only me and these 3 other guys. And a lot of times they were overlapping, right? But they weren't including each other, maybe on purpose or maybe not, you know, like you said, maybe because they just didn't know about the other guy or something, right? But so...
Yeah, there's definitely some rivalries, and, you know, there were plenty of guys that were like, oh, yeah, I heard that guy said that he was doing it first, but, you know, no one ever saw a knife in that. When I came out with it, then it became a popular thing. And so a lot of times I would include both stories, you know, like, okay, you know, reportedly this person was the first to use whatever, and then this person may have popularized it. You know, Gil Hibben probably helped popularize 440C. In the 60s. He had some students, and it spread around. But, you know, it was the most common high carbon stainless. So, you know, if people are looking for stainless steels, they're probably going to find 440C.
Yeah.
A case where I had to run into this a lot was in the Damascus chapters, because people would invent patterns and they didn't know when, you know, or they'd say, oh, I started doing that in 1978. But I would look in every knife book I could find and couldn't find one until 1985. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so frequently throughout the Damascus chapters, it says like, okay, you know, Devin Thomas tells me he did this in the year 1999, and I found the first example of it in Knives 2002. Yeah. You know, that kind of thing.
Right.
So like, okay, that gap's pretty small. Like, he probably did it around the date that he said. Other times the dates are a little more spread. Like, oh, this guy says he was doing this in 1968. Well, I found the first example in a book of photos from Jim Wire, you know, 20 years later.
Right. Right.
The Damascus chapters are pretty intriguing, and the pictures and stuff that go with it. That Rados, it gets example bar. It makes me wonder, like, I wonder where that is. Someone's got it in their collection, and that'd be such a cool piece to have. It's kind of, to explain to the listeners, it's kind of a Turkish twist, showing how it's made, forged out, and kind of spreads out to show the twisting, and then it's got it etched, and it's such a cool example. Probably was on his table or something, I would assume.
Yeah, I think he brought it to shows, and somebody just photographed it. So.
Oh man, that's cool.
Yeah, so you see, when you make Turkish twist, you have to make several bars of twist. So you have alternating layers of steel. You forge it out like a normal, you know, stack of pattern welded Damascus. Then you round it out. You know, you hammer the corners to make it sort of a, you know, a hexagon, octagon, whatever. Then you twist it either by hand or with some kind of twisting device. Then you've got multiple rods of twist, and you basically forge those together. And then it doesn't really look like twist anymore. It looks like stars and radials or something. It's hard to describe without someone actually seeing it. And the pattern also changes as you grind into it. It's one of the cool things about the pattern.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Damascus chapters were very fun because I was able to interview, you know, almost every person that contributed significantly to Damascus. And so, you know, you could hear it from them. You could hear the rivalries. You could hear the stories between the different people.
Yeah.
You know, people that to me were mostly legendary figures, you know, Don Fogg or Daryl Meyer were some of the early real innovators in Damascus. And contacting them could be difficult because they're old or they don't like social media or phones anymore.
Right.
So definitely my dad helped give me some credibility on some of that. I only ran into one guy that refused to talk to me because of who my father was. So, so as a side tangent, that was something that I was a little bit interested in. I know my dad quite well. I know his good traits, and I also know his flaws. So,
Right.
Like talking to all his old buddies or old competitors, I was curious, like, what am I going to find here?
Right.
Are people going to tell me stories about how much they loved hanging out with my dad? Are they going to say he's an a-hole and they can't believe what they did to them?
Right.
And so it was gratifying. My dad is very religious, and, he has high ethical and moral standards.
Yeah.
And, he's also a fun guy. I don't want to just paint him as a serious, man. But that was one thing that many of his friends talked about. Like, okay, your dad was always very ethical and he cared a lot about things. He would ask us to tone down the swearing or, politely refuse some of the harder substances that they were using. So
Yeah.
so it's good to hear those stories. And the one guy, I won't get too into it, but I was able to look into this guy that is saying my dad did this or this to him, and there was nothing there.
Yeah.
So I mean, so that was very good. There are people on the internet that can say worse things about me than this guy was claiming about my dad. So
Yeah. Right.
so one of the things he was saying was that that my dad never gave him credit. And I was like, well, I have an article from 20 years ago where he lists 3 people that helped him early on, and you were on the list. And he's like, well, send me the article and we'll see. And then like 6 months later, actually just a few weeks ago, he emailed me and apologized. But, I just said, thank you for apologizing. That we're done. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about that, and I actually put something in my notes about it that, one, how cool is it to be able to write a book like this, and there's a chunk of it that's about your father, right? I mean, that's like that's just a neat thing, right? It makes me smile. And like you said, this kind of interesting aspect of it where, there's like a family business angle where, okay, maybe that helps open some doors for some of the conversations that you wanted to have, right? And also has the pitfalls that you potentially could run into, like you described, right? So I don't know, it's very interesting. It makes me feel like this was maybe a little more personal than if somebody else wrote it.
It was very personal. Sometimes the parts related to my dad were more difficult to do.
Yeah.
Because if my dad says, I was the first person to do this in 1994, and then I talk to another guy and he says, I was the first person to do that in 1993, well, I can't look biased.
Yeah.
And so I've got to doubly find evidence for who did what when and make sure that I've got all my I's dotted and all my T's crossed.
Right.
And so that could be challenging sometimes. And so there were a couple things where I call up my dad and I'm like, hey, you're not going to be in the book as doing that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're trying to write this book and you also need to show up at Thanksgiving. So
yeah. Like, I think it's kind of 50-50 as to who did it, and you're my dad, and unfortunately the 50-50's got to go the other way.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Every Thanksgiving, you just had to write the book.
Exactly. It becomes the sore spot. Yeah. I think, I'm stuck on the ads because I just loved them. So, it's really cool with your Magna Cut thing, Laren. I know that was, you got a lot of inspiration or love for these vintage ads.
Yeah.
And it was obviously a strong influence in the artwork that the guy did for you. What do you have a favorite from these old advertisements that are in here?
Oh, there's a lot of good ones. My favorite is for 5160. So 5160 is interesting because it didn't come out until the 50s. So people think 5160 must have been around since the beginning of time. But there's another steel used in springs called 6150. And you can see with all the many dyslexic knife makers out there that these are frequently confused. And so old Ford Model Ts use 6150.
Ah.
And so it was common for years, 6150. Ford would even advertise it. Because this was a vanadium alloyed steel. Vanadium alloyed steels were a brand new thing.
Yeah.
And so Ford, he discovered that they were making these vanadium steels, and he's hiring the guys that are researching it so that he can get that into his automobiles. And that was 6150. Well, much later in the 50s, well, the ad is 1949, so we'll say late 40s. And we got a guy pointing at a dude behind a desk, and he says, "All right, give me one good reason why I should try this new spring steel." So we gave him 3. And then, it lists all the great things about this new spring steel.
Yes.
Another one is for, I don't know if I can find it, but it's for M2. So the most common high-speed steel back in the day is under the designation T1. And it was a high tungsten steel. So it had 18% tungsten in it, a lot of tungsten. They were discovering when we were hitting war times, so the U.S. doesn't have a good source for tungsten. And so we'd get into war and there would be shortages of tungsten. And so there was a big push to develop molybdenum alloyed steels instead. And so the first companies that came out with what is now known as M2, I found ads from them where they were advertising, how do you know that next boat is going to come in, with the shipment of tungsten? You should switch to our steel.
Right.
So you're getting, okay, I finally found it. It's on page 75. It's an ad from 1941 for Allegheny Ludlam DBL steel, which is M2. So yeah, it shows a guy, again, pointing. Apparently there's a lot of pointing in the 1940s. And, white old dudes in suits. So he says, yes, but suppose that ship doesn't come in. And it says DBL high-speed steel helps to conserve the nation's supply of tungsten and to protect you against possible shortage because it contains less than 1/3 as much tungsten as 1841. That's T1. And DBL's performance actually equals or beats 1841, and it costs less. So, that's some of the fun stuff that you find
By the way, you have a fantastic 1920s advertiser's voice. That sounds exactly like it.
Yeah, I did that a little bit more. I made a video in November. I drove the whole family out to Bethlehem because they've got an old Bethlehem steel plant there. And so we just went and filmed me in an old-looking suit. And I told the story of the discovery of high-speed steel. And we did it in, muted colors. And we put on the old, symphony soundtrack in the background.
Newsreel soundtrack. That's what it makes me think of.
So go look that up. That was a fun video. And, we stopped at Hershey on the way there and went to Hershey Park. Yeah. So that made the family happy. So it wasn't just a trip to film me in front of an old steel plant.
Yeah. Yeah, I made a note to ask you if your wife thought you were crazy. We're going to do what?
Yeah, she does think I'm crazy, but not just for that reason.
It's on the list, though. Yeah, that I thought the video was really fun. It's sort of almost like a teaser for the book, right? Was that the concept behind doing that, or because that was one of the stories you just talked about?
Yeah, one of the early concepts I had. So when I said I'll do 2 or 3 articles, I said, well, I'll do 2 or 3 videos along with it. There would be an article and a video.
Okay.
And I was looking at where all these steels were developed, and a lot of them were developed here where I am now in Pennsylvania. A lot in the Pittsburgh area, some up in New York, but within a 3 to 5 hour radius, I can get to the locations from where a lot of these steels came from.
Right.
D2 came out from Firth Sterling, and that's in McKeesport. I can drive there in 15 minutes. It's just like an empty lot owned by a railroad company now, but that's where it came from. I can drive down to Latrobe where Vasco was, the guy that stole T15, and they also developed Vasco ware there and a bunch of other stuff. A steel called Hypercut, which was the name I used to come up with MagnaCut.
Right.
So that's right in Latrobe. It's an hour away. So I was like, I'll just drive out to all these cool locations and talk about these individual stories. Now that ended up being too big of a concept, but I'm like, okay, Bethlehem, they've got a cool old steel plant. It's a few hours drive, a little farther than some of these other locations, but it's a great filming spot. This story is early in the book. It's a cool story. So that's what I'll use. And so the book grew, the video concept shrank, and it became that video on Bethlehem.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's well done. Did your wife do the editing and stuff as well?
No, my wife refuses to read any of my books. But
No, I mean of the video.
oh, yeah, she helped with the editing. She is a birth photographer.
Oh, that's right. I remember you talking about that.
So she's also in a couple of my videos. We did a Hot Ones parody where we ate wings with hot sauce on
There
them.
you go, yeah.
And we did my Steel ratings video is called Mr. Neighbor Rates Knife Steel, something like that. And so that's a parody of Mr. Rogers. And she was the Miss Jessica talking to the owl puppet in the video.
Yeah.
So I mostly edit my own videos. She helped a little bit with that one. You know, she knows more video editing than I do. So I come and ask her for help. And
Right.
so... But yeah, I got a handful of knife makers to read the book. The hardest part is just getting knife makers to read a 500-page book.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I got some help. They can't be blamed for the remaining typos. I definitely got the number of typos down lower than Knife Engineering, but it's real tough to find every typo when you've got that many words.
Yeah.
So-
I think the preview copy that you sent me a long time ago, I don't think it had illustrations in it yet.
Really?
Man,
that must have been early.
Yeah, or maybe not as many. I don't know. But yeah, that's really cool. The video is really fun for anybody who hasn't seen it. Go definitely check it out on YouTube, on Laren's channel. It's cool. It's well done.
I love in the book, like, it's like everything's in there, even like the most obscure, like the Gerber with the Vasco-ware blades and stuff like that. Almar's in here. It's like, it's so cool.
Yeah.
It's like just about anybody that was anyone back in the day is in the book. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. It's technical, it's historical, it's very well done.
Yeah, let's talk about Gerber and Almar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the entire high-end knife industry, so production knives as they stand now, they all trace back to Gerber.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
I can say that almost without reservation. And I think to the average Joe, they're like, oh, Gerber, those are like blister pack Walmart knives.
Right,
Like,
right.
They are
who
now.
cares about Gerber? They're a shell of their former selves. And they rose out from like the 30s, the 40s. I mean, really early on, and World War II kind of cut in the middle of Gerber early on. So they were paying a guy named David Z. Murphy to make their knives.
Yep.
And they would use old hacksaw blades out of T1 high-speed steel. Later, they moved to M2. But so they paid this guy. That guy got kind of fed up with working for them, and he started making his own combat knives in World War II. Then Gerber had to start up their own production. They kept using hacksaw blades. Then hacksaw blades all moved to like the dual construction where only the teeth are hardened,
Mm-hmm.
And so they had to switch to M2 from Crucible. And they just kind of grew, and then they built their own factory. And they were the big production company. There are others that sort of were in a similar time period, like Buck came a little bit later. But Buck was more in the middle. They sort of played in the same game as the cheaper manufacturers and a little bit more expensive, like Gerber. So I think Buck does have some claim. But anyway, so Almar was a designer for Gerber. Well, he did more than designing. He did a lot of stuff for Gerber. He goes off and does his own thing. Pete Kershaw was like a head of sales, something like that. You'll have to read the book so that you get the details correct. He goes off and make his own knife company. That was possible in part because Gerber had started outsourcing certain knives to Japan, and they basically helped build up Japan. So Loveless also helped some with that. Where Japan was making knives, but they were what we now think of as like the gas station garbage knives.
Yeah.
So they're like, the Japanese are making Nikon cameras and like Honda motorcycles. Like surely you can make high-end knives. And they could. And so they started making higher-end knives for Gerber. Then Almar and Pete Kershaw started having their knives made in Japan. And then companies like Spyderco would go and get their knives made at the same factories. And a lot of current people in the industry credited Almar with being their inspiration, that he started his own company. He was very giving and would give out information, like give his contacts to factories and things like that. A lot of people don't know who Al Marr is anymore.
Yeah.
And so,
crazy.
and then other companies came. So,
yeah, I for sure personally didn't realize both Pete Kershaw and Al Marr came out of Gerber. That was an interesting link for me. Like, oh.
So I personally love the early Gerber knives, the aluminum handles and everything. And I'd say I've probably got a couple hundred here in the shop.
holy cow.
Yeah, for some reason I love the Burden Trout that they did. And for quite a while, you could get them on eBay. You'd buy like 10 at a time for like $40 or something.
Wow.
And I've got a couple boxes that they're just dumped in there. I figured, they were super cheap at the time and they're really good. And I figured for like less than $10 a piece, anytime I saw them for less than $10 a piece, I would buy them for a couple years. And
Smart.
now I've got a whole bunch of them.
There
I don't
you
know
go.
what I'm going to do with them. I thought about blasting the handles and Cerakoting them and tuning them back up, but I don't know. They'll
You're just
probably
going to
stay in
hoard
the
them.
box.
Yeah.
What?
Hello.
Yeah, there's nothing gonna happen with those except you hoarding them. And that's
know.
why we love you.
That's right. Don't even act like you're going to do something with them, Tom. You know what you're going to do? You're going to sit on them until they're worth $1 million.
Yeah, they'll never go.
If you
I
sit
do
on
have
them
some
long
cool ones, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What one of the interesting things was you had some nice stuff in there, Laren, about the kind of the beginnings and evolution of the knife making supply side of this, right? And how that made all of this much more accessible to people, right? Having a place where they could actually buy the stuff that they need instead of, I don't know. It seemed like some of these makers were really kind of scratching, right? Like, well, where the hell am I going to get this, right? Or I see people using these steels and there's nowhere to get it, right? So you want to talk a little bit about the knife making supply stuff? And it looked like that kind of was late 60s up into the mid 80s was when it was kind of starting to flourish.
Yeah. So the first, what we'll call major guy with a catalog that you could order from was Bob Schrimsher. I believe his name is pronounced. But he was
I'm glad you said it because I was reading it and I'm like, is that Schrimsher? Yeah, I don't know.
But he was not the first knife supply person. The first knife supplier was A.G. Russell.
Yeah.
And just like Gerber is the source of all of the production knife industry as it stands now, the high end, A.G. Russell is the source of the entire custom knife industry as it stands now. So remember, A.G. is the OG. That's how you do it.
Yeah, there you go.
So A.G. Russell, he lived in Arkansas. So to me as a kid, A.G. Russell was a catalog, not a person. But
right.
I was able to talk to him not long before he died. I thought he was great. I asked him questions about like stainless steel in the 60s and stuff like that. But A.G. Russell, he was in Arkansas and he wanted to start selling Arkansas sharpening stones. He's like, oh, there's these great stones. You can't hardly buy them. No one knows about them. So he wanted to start selling these cool sharpening stones. And so he wanted to do ads with his sharpening stones, and he wanted to have a cool knife in the ad. So he starts looking up custom knife makers, and he finds a handful of them. One of the early ones he finds is D.E. Henry. And he goes to D.E. Henry, and D.E. Henry has a Bob Loveless knife. And A.G. is like, holy cow, look at this knife. It's incredible. Who made this knife? And at first, D.E.'s like, oh, no, I'm not telling you who made this,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And so A.G., he would tell the story about getting custom knife makers together, and he would emphasize a lot the jealousy that existed between the small handful of people. There's only a few of them, 5, 10, maybe 20.
Right.
Including people like D.E. Henry and Bill Moran and Bob Loveless. And I think a lot of that comes from D.E. Henry, where D.E. Henry, he's known for being cantankerous and not very friendly.
Yep.
So this is well known. I'm not breaking a story here. And so A.G. Russell, he he went on a road trip visiting all of these custom knife makers that he found out about. And then he booked a bunch of tables at the biggest gun show, and that were all next to each other. And he invited all these knife makers to come to this gun show.
In Tulsa.
Yeah, so people could see all of the cool knives. And so they get all these custom knife makers together, and he and Bob Loveless start talking about making a guild so that the knife makers can share things with each other, that they can pool together for certain things. And so AG was sort of the ringleader for all of this. They formed the guild. They said that the president of the guild, or whatever they called it, that originally it was called the secretary, then it became the president, had to be a knife maker. So they made A.G. Russell like an honorary president, where the secretary had to be a knife maker. That later became a president. Anyway, we're getting in the weeds. So, but A.G. Russell was the guy early on. He brought all of this together. He was really the source of everything. And of course, he went on to buy Morseth Knives, which was the origin of Bob Dozier. And, he had his own knife selling company, which became the catalog I referenced earlier.
Right.
And he was the main knife supplier. Bob Shrimshire went to him and was like, hey, I'd like to get into knife supply. And A.G. Russell said, good, you can have it. Like, this is just a chore for me, trying to source all of these and sell. And so Shrimshire, there were a ton of stories from people in magazine articles that I found where they were like, oh, Bob Shrimshire, he would just give you stuff. Like, you'd say, oh, sorry, Bob, I don't have money. And he's like, that's fine, here you go. And they would say, like, he didn't even know me. Like, he didn't know if I was going to pay him back. And so there were some great stories about Bob Shrimshire.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, more than the knife makers influencing knife steel, like Bob Loveless introducing 154 CM, a lot of what people use is dictated by the suppliers. They can't go to the steel company and order 50,000 pounds of steel.
Right.
They can't afford that. And so instead, the suppliers buy the steel. And so one of the steels I mentioned is 06, which nobody uses anymore. It was one of the most common steels in the early 70s. And I'm like, 06? Why were people using 06? And then I found an ad from early Blade magazine from Shrimshire, and in his 4 or 5 steels he was selling was 06. So, they were using 06 because it was available.
Right.
It was being sold by the knife supplier.
One of those availability, necessity kind of get together, right?
Exactly.
I've got it. You need it. There you. This is the stuff you should use.
Mm-hmm.
And that continues to today. I mean, people buy what's available from the knife supply and the steel supply companies.
Right. Yeah, and I'm the AG thing is something I wanted to talk about too. Not just the supply part, right? But the whole. You mentioned in one of the sections of the book about AG pulling in magazine people to be able to write articles to put into gun magazines and stuff, right? To help get exposure and start to grow the industry, which, I mean, that everybody wins in that situation. Certainly AG does as well, right? If knives start getting more visibility and start to sell more, that's good for his business too. But certainly a kind of blossoming point for the industry.
Yeah, that was the real turning point. So, Bill Moran, he reintroduced Damascus, which didn't really go away, but he did reintroduce it. I think everybody agrees with that. And it wouldn't have blown up like it did if there wasn't already a guild. There was already a guild show or a guild section of a gun show for everybody to get excited about the Damascus. Everybody's all in a tizzy. Like, did you see what's on Bill Moran's table?
Right.
Same thing with 154 CM. Though it was introduced by Loveless just like a year before the big Damascus introduction, maybe 2 years. You'll have to look at the book for the correct details. But
AG was a great salesman.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literally, he had a mine, a quarry for Arkansas whetstones. And he's such a good salesman. He literally built an industry to sell them to. It's crazy.
Right.
I mean, it grew bigger than that, much bigger. But that was the original intent.
Yeah. So if you think about it too hard, it can start to look a little malicious or self-serving.
No, I
But,
don't. I don't
he
think
had
that's
those
a bad
stones to
thing.
sell, and he brought all the people together. You know, like
yeah,
you said.
exactly.
I mean, obviously it was self-serving and capitalistic, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing.
No.
You know, I think
He did it the right
It
way.
was synergistic.
hmm
Oh.
Wow.
Mm.
Have we used the
Do
word
I need to explain that to you guys?
have we used the word synergistic on Mark of the Maker in 113 episodes?
I hope not.
First time.
Yeah. Gosh, it feels like I'm at work. Weird.
Yeah, business term.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh my.
Well done, Tom, on synergistic.
I'm glad that we just stopped the whole podcast just to point that out.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Wow.
My
Knife.
8th grade education. I
Tom's-
surprised you guys.
Tom's own book he's been working on, Knife Maker Synergy.
Boom.
Yeah. Tom, you worked for AG, right?
Yeah. I ran their custom shop for 2.5 years. And then,
Before you went to work with Bob?
yeah, well, before that, I worked with Bob and basically was a shop foreman and dealt with AG and Goldie quite a bit.
Yeah.
I got in trouble when I worked for AG quite a bit because I didn't work for AG. I worked for Goldie.
Yeah.
AG would come down to the shop and talk and ask me to make stuff, and I would be like, sure. And then I get in trouble for it.
Yeah. Caught in the middle.
I figured it out, though. Goldie helped me see the light.
I
Yeah.
do think there is some of that, you know, where some of these companies, the wife behind the scenes is
Yeah.
doing a lot of the real business work, sometimes even the real knife work, you know,
Oh, yeah.
and their stories get forgotten. I wish I could have included more women in my book. Maybe
Yeah.
I could have. There are a very small number of female.
Marilyn
beverages.
Lyle is one that for sure did that.
Oh, yeah. So that's also in my book where Jimmy Lyle's wife, she was grinding blades early on. So, I
She
mean,
ran the company after he died.
yeah. So, and, you know, Anne Reeve, so continuing Chris
Yep.
Reeve knives, you know, Goldie, we mentioned. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so many books that could be written, you know, the women of knives. There's no book on
Yeah.
Gerber that I could find. There's tons of stuff out there that needs to be covered more in depth than what I did, for
Yeah,
sure.
You got a lot of work to do, a lot of books to write.
Not coming from me, but I hope somebody does it.
What one of the spots that a wife was involved in a big time way was in Buck, right? In the early times of Buck. Am I mixing up my companies?
Sorry, what about Buck?
I thought in your background on Buck Knives that kind of before they turned into a factory, right, and took shareholders and all that stuff, it was a mom and pop kind of business, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think is it Al Buck? Am I remembering that right? From when I
So
read this.
Al Buck was the son
Okay.
of the original knife maker Buck, who now I am spacing on. So remember, we were supposed to talk about this back in May. So
Yeah, right.
so let me get to the right page. Okay, Hoyt Buck
Okay.
was the original. And so he made knives. He would make them from old files. He really got going more with knife making in World War II. I've got a chapter on World War II knives. So, you know, there was this big drive to make knives for our boys for World War II. So Pearl Harbor happened. And unfortunately, there was a lot of racism driving this as well. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, which you can find in some of these old quotes. But so Pearl Harbor happened, we got into World War II, and they said, we need knives. And so lots of people started making knives for World War II. One of them was Hoyt Buck. And so this company grew. You know, they would do their advertising showing that they could cut bolts with their knives. They would just grind them from old files. They said they would stack up the files just like firewood. They just have piles and piles of them. And so Hoyt, he ended up in poor health. I believe he had some type of cancer. And so this was a real, you know, difficult period. And they're like, what's going to happen to the knife company without Hoyt? He does all the grinding. And so Al, he started working every day on how to grind. from his dad, and finally got it so that he could grind.
Yeah.
And so Al Buck was able to continue the company.
Very interesting stuff. What, looking at my notes here, Heat Treat. Really interesting section on Paul Boss. Am I saying his name right? Paul Boss? Yeah.
I've heard lots of people say Bose, but it's definitely Boss.
Right. That's what I thought. I thought you're right up in that section was really good, Laren. Like there was certainly history that I didn't know. And that's kind of a cool story, right? About going from a school project to a heat treat shop to turning a hobby into a business, right? It was kind of interesting because in some ways it reminded me of some kind of knife maker journeys as well, right? Where it starts out as one thing, turns into this sort of side hustle, and then boom, becomes a pretty significant business to the tune of 70% of the of the makers using them for heat treat, right?
Yeah, Paul Boss was the guy. He wasn't the original heat treater like early 70s stuff. People were really on their own just trying to find people. But Paul Boss, like you said, he did a school project where he heat treated some O1, he quenched it all in water and they all cracked and he failed the project.
Right.
So what a mean teacher. Where
yeah.
He did try to heat treat them.
Right.
And so then he talks to a heat treater guy and he's like, "Oh yeah, you gotta quench that in oil, son," kind of thing. And he goes and he works for the heat treater. He loves it. And then, he's got friends of the Buck family. They need knives heat treated. He starts doing more and more stuff for Buck. He makes his own heat treating company that's supposed to do industrial heat treating. But he convinced Loveless to start sending him his knives. And that was really when things blew up. Once he had Loveless on his side, everyone wanted to copy Loveless. He was the man. So Boss Heat Treating gets huge. Buck builds a new fancy factory, and they do a deal with Paul Boss where they say, do your heat treating at our new facility. You can still heat treat for custom knife makers at our shop. And so they work a deal, and he's able to run his facility that way. And like you said, like 70% of custom knife makers or something are going to Paul Boss. Another person who is becoming more and more forgotten, I think, as we're replaced by other companies like Peters or other big names like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Paul Boss, he was the man. Another guy that should not be forgotten.
Super good dude, and probably the only heat treater inducted into the Knife Making Hall of Fame.
Oh, yeah.
He's a really good dude. He heat treated a lot of my blades early on.
Yeah.
Well, all of them.
So
And
that...
Boss Heat Treating still does exist, run by another Paul Farner, I believe is his name.
Yeah.
That's
So
correct.
they're still out there. They still do a good work.
Is it independent today, or is it still part of the Buck operation? Does anyone know?
They
It
moved.
is still part of the Buck operation. I was there just a few months ago.
Oh, wow.
They moved with them to Idaho, and they're inside the plant.
Check that out. Wow.
It's pretty cool.
Paul Boss found it, man. I make less money now, but I'm much happier once you've stepped into doing that. Not everybody finds that. You mentioned Peters, and then I think just a little bit later than that was this whole kind of the advent of DIY in the heat treatment aspect of this, right? With the idea of knife makers having their own furnace. And that doesn't go back that far.
No, very few people were heat treating their own knives back in the 70s and 80s, even into the 90s. So one of the first was Paragon. So they started marketing a furnace in the mid 80s. Looks like my book says 1986. The Paragon KM14. And they started doing a bunch of ads. They were affordable furnaces at the time, just a few $100s. And so, you didn't have to deal with sending stuff to a heat treater, waiting for it to come back. They might have a minimum number of knives till you get a good price, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so you could heat treat at home. And then also, it's blossomed into this thing where custom knife makers advertise that they have their own heat treatments, right? Which was not as much of a thing back then when everybody was sending out. It was more common with the bladesmiths, who would use a torch or a forge or whatever. But finally, for the stock removal makers with Paragon and then Even Heat furnaces, it became much more doable, much more affordable. And yeah, that really evolved. So, I mean, Ed Fowler, he was advertising Paragon furnaces, lots of other knife makers. And so that leads to people like me. So, my dad, he had Paragon and Even Heat furnaces at his shop. And when I bought a furnace, I bought an Even Heat. And, there are custom knife makers interested in all the different variables of heat treating from these companies. So.
Yep. Another kind of twist in the story, right? That changes things a bunch. Okay, so 12 chapters on Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild.
My favorite part. There's no stone left unturned on that.
Yeah.
For those that want to make, there's diagrams on how some of that stuff is made, some mysteries of the history of how it was done. It was fantastic to see. I had no idea about who did some of the first stainless Damascus.
Yeah.
It was just, nothing is left uncovered. That's why I had to ask about some sort of research team, because good Lord.
Yeah.
Well, I had my dad.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's
That
full of
helps.
stories.
Yeah.
And I had access to all of his old buddies. And so, I called them all up. So, I mean, the main history available prior to this book came from Steve Schwarzer.
Yeah.
Which is great. I'm glad he recorded that history, but it's only from Steve, right? And so, he gets some other people's stories in there, but it's mostly a story about things he was involved in, right? That's just how it works. So I really wanted to expand on this, all the other people that were involved. And, Steve might say, okay, this guy did this, but, he's not telling that person's whole story. So I called up a bunch of these people. I was able to speak to Don Fogg, but only briefly. And luckily, Josh Smith had done a pretty long podcast interview with Don Fogg that I was able to also pull stuff from. So I was very crafty, magazine articles, podcasts, just really obscure stuff, random books, like stuff in the back of Knives 86, there'd be a random article from somebody. Of course, I called everybody that I could. And then I had to go through and find all of the initial pieces. So the Knives Annuals were a big help for that. Some of the magazines, but the Knives Annual were really where it's at. If you ever want to see the evolution of knife making, just go and buy every Knives Annual like I did.
Yeah.
So,
I think we recommended that quite a bit. Those are fantastic resources.
yeah, all the old ones are in black and white, which kind of sucks.
Yeah.
But you can really see the evolution of style, what people were doing. And so yeah, I'm very proud of the Damascus chapters. If you make Damascus, you have to buy the book. I know that is self-serving to me.
I agree. 100%. You cover the old and the new, and it's so well done.
And, and I don't just show the patterns. Like you said, I show how they're made. So like all the basic styles, it's not a how-to, but it shows you, it demystifies some of it.
Well, I don't know how many times I've stared at that Don Fogg and that Life and Death collab he did and didn't realize that it was Feather Pattern from the 90s. I did not know that he helped popularize the Feather Pattern and that he had gotten that from, like you said in there, was a Javanese.
Yeah, so Javanese meaning Java, not Japanese, Japan.
Right.
And a lot of patterns were like that. So still to this day, there are new quote unquote patterns coming out, which are being recreated from hundreds or thousands of years ago. So the Vikings, Java, limited cases, the Chinese, Europe, like France and Belgium. So they're just constantly recreating this old stuff. And I also have a chapter on like the present and future of Damascus, where I interviewed a couple guys like Salem Straub or Mareko, and they both were recreating old patterns. So I mean, I would see things that they made, and I'm like, oh, this is crazy. Like, you don't know this, but this comes from this old like Belgian, gun steel, and they're like, oh no, we know,
Yeah.
So you can find the inspirations. And so it's a Damascus is crazy because, you know, it's got this ancient, cool history, patterning techniques that they're still recreating, future techniques which are randomly discovered. That's another exciting thing about Damascus is it's not just like painting. Like if you're a painter, you learn painting, right? And there are techniques for painting. You visualize something, you see a picture of something, and you paint it, right? With Damascus, you can have a concept or an idea, and then you forge it out, and at the end, you find out what you got. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it doesn't do exactly what you want. If you get really good, you can come up with concepts and be like, okay, when I forge it like this, it's going to manipulate it in this direction. So you intuitively might think it's going to look like this, but I'm going to use the fact that metal moves like this when I forge it with the hammer to make the pattern look like this. And so there's this combination of skill and learning and discovery and history to making these patterns, which I think is really cool and something definitely not well described in prior, you know, magazine articles or books, and was one of the things I wanted to portray in the book is the excitement of the discovery and the development of Damascus itself. And like I said, it's really not anywhere. You can read some Steve Schwarzer articles, which are pretty good, but there's so much more. And a lot of it is in this book. So, and most of it's original. So new interviews and things.
Yeah, it's kind of like a rediscovery or rebirth, right? Of stuff. I mean, there's obviously a bunch of new techniques and the evolution of stainless, but it's kind of almost like a revival thing. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then old techniques become new.
Yeah.
And old and new techniques are combined together to make new patterns and new techniques. And there's copying and there's working together. And, you know, they started looking at powder. And the most recent invention or discovery or technique developed is using 3D printing to be able to make different patterns.
Yep.
So yeah, there's always new stuff happening in Damascus. I think there were a handful of knife makers that told me, oh, well, the subtitle says Damascus in it. I don't care about Damascus. And I'm like, please try to expand your horizon. You know?
Yeah.
I promise not everything you learn has to be about stock removal, you know, 154 cm knives. Like there's some cool stuff to learn.
There's some German Damascus patterns on page 219. There's like 6 of them all in a vertical picture.
Yeah.
How far back is that? Those are gorgeous patterns and very intricate.
Yeah. So this comes from a book by Manfred Saxe, I think is how you pronounce it.
Okay.
He had passed away, so I didn't get to talk to him. But he was a big deal in Germany, and he wrote a book more on ancient Damascus.
Yeah.
With some focus on German Damascus. So my book is very much like 1900 onward. And his book is a lot of, you know, 1950 backward. So I highly recommend buying his book. You know, they can become companion pieces.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, these patterns can date from all over the place. I think these particular ones are like early 1900s or late 1800s.
Okay.
But I'd have to check that. You can definitely find out in Manfred's book,
Right.
which I recommend if you want to learn more. But yeah, the Germans used a different type of patterning. There's 2 major ways you can create the basic pattern types, like ladder and raindrop, they're called. One is cutting into the bar and then forging it flat. And the other is deforming the bar and then grinding it flat.
Yeah.
So like swaging, I think it's called. And so the Germans did the deforming method. So they would get these dies. You see like a hammer and it has like a swirl on the face of it. So that they would take another hammer and then they would hit it, you know, down the bar so that they would press this pattern in and then they would grind into it. And so my dad, he did it the German method, though he didn't know that that's how the Germans were doing it when he started making his. And so it creates a very tight, controlled, consistent pattern. And it looks different than grinding. So, you know, like you can make raindrop by drilling a bunch of holes and then forging it flat, or taking like basically ball bearings and a die and pressing them in. And so the pattern looks different. And so like for my dad, it made his patterns extremely consistent. You didn't have to drill a bunch of holes by hand. And so people could get repeatable Damascus every time. And that became the standard.
So kind of one of the further expansion or blossoming of this thing is with Daryl Meyer.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk a little bit about Daryl and kind of what came out of his work?
Yeah, so Daryl Meyer, he's the father of Damascus, but they say, so Bill Moran's the father, Daryl Meyer is the grandfather of Damascus.
Yeah.
So Bill Moran, he reintroduced it. Daryl Meyer was the guy that really brought in a bunch of the patterning techniques and things. So he had a little group, they call it the Damascus Research Team, in the early 70s. And they did a bunch of research, looking through the old European literature and things, trying to figure out patterning. And they had a chapter in a book pretty early on where they laid out a lot of major patterning techniques. And Daryl Meyer was the first guy that really started selling Damascus, which was a big deal. You think, like, what does it matter selling Damascus? You can make it in a knife or you can make it for sale. No, that was not the case in the early 70s. People like Bill Moran said, this is a custom product. You have to make it like a real bladesmith and then forge it into a blade. If you don't forge it into a blade, then it's just stock removal nonsense. That's not real Damascus. They're trying to sell lower quality stuff. So it was a minor scandal when Daryl Meyer started selling it, because the bladesmiths were like, oh no, this is sole authorship. We make our Damascus for our knives. Right. We're not giving it to the dirty stock removal makers.
Right.
And so Daryl Meyer, he was very influential. He's the first guy to start selling Damascus, which became a business unto itself that my dad also started doing. He published on all the different patterning techniques. He was a student of the ancient patterning ways, and he also developed a lot of his own patterning styles. He popularized Turkish twist. We were talking about the Jerry Rados Turkish earlier. He reintroduced to the world putting letters into steel, which became a major technique for mosaic patterns and things. And then he made a very famous buoy for President Bush, which had American flags. It was an amazing piece. It got quite a bit of press in the early 90s. But yeah, Daryl Meyer, another guy who was mostly forgotten, who had a huge impact on Damascus. I'd say, Bill Moran, he was very influential for introducing Damascus, not so much on, developing the styles and the techniques. Daryl Meyer and Don Fogg, we can throw in, guys like Steve Schwarzer, are some of the really influential people for the development of patterning and things like that. So that's the kind of stuff you don't read in Blade Magazine. Blade Magazine, when I was looking, they've literally got 10 articles on Bill Moran reintroducing Damascus.
Yeah.
And not very many on Daryl Meyer and Don Fogg. So,
yeah.
Did you talk to Daryl?
I did, yeah. Yeah, he's still alive.
What's he doing now?
Being retired.
He used to be really good friends with Bob Dozier.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
And he came down to the shop all the time. And I've actually got some blades up front that are steel from Daryl Meyer that I never finished. I've got lots of stuff like that. But I want to say he was talking about doing a vineyard or something when he was 20 years ago, whatever.
Yeah, he and I did not talk about that, but I mostly asked about Damascus. So
yeah. I wonder, is he still in Illinois?
Yes.
I wonder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of these stories can be a little bit sad as these guys are aging.
Yeah.
There's a lot of guys where they do these interviews back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and they're like, I'm going to die in front of my grinder, and it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah.
Eventually your health declines or you lose the passion or some combination.
Yeah.
There was a really sad story of Ted Dowell. I don't remember if I put this in the book. So Ted Dowell, he was an early influential guy in the 70s. And as he got older, he started to have cognitive decline, and the quality of his knives started to decline along with it. And so, his family, started making sure those knives didn't get sold. And then eventually he just became too dangerous to himself and, had to stop him.
Yeah.
And so, it's sad.
That's
So
heartbreaking.
I worry about that, and I tell my wife, if I start to, get Alzheimer's or something, just take me up to the shop and turn me loose. I'll be all right, and come pick me up at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's like my happy place,
Right. Do we want to hit a little bit about stainless?
okay, stainless was invented by a British man in the 20s.
All right. Good stuff.
But I've got a whole chapter on him. You can read
Next time.
how he invented it, but his story, he wrote like a whole autobiography, and he was really cool. He was really funny, and so I had a whole chapter with his quotes, and he invented the knife steel 420, the most denigrated knife steel, and I found a quote from him where he acknowledged that he's known for making the steel that doesn't cut. So,
Oh, wow.
That's harsh.
So you can read about that. So that was pretty easy to find. Everyone knows the story of stainless. It also gets more complicated because it was actually invented in Germany before it was invented in Britain. So it's a complex story. Different people claim to have invented stainless.
Yeah.
But the first commercial stainless was 420, invented by that British guy. And then it was first made commercially by Firth Sterling in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. So that's one tease. The hard part to find was, where did 440 stainless come from? 440 A, B, and C. That was not anywhere. And tracking that down was extremely difficult. And I still don't know the first knife companies who actually used it. They did not advertise what steel types they used. They just said, this is stainless. I couldn't even find companies until 1937 that said that they had two different types of steel, and that was only in the materials that they gave their salespeople. It was not in, like, the catalogs. So that was extremely difficult. There's still more work to be done there. If we can find knives, because these tang stamps are always like 20-year periods. So if we can find knives in like very specific years and go test them all, we might be able to figure it out when the knife companies first use them. But 440A came out in 1925, and you can find out by who in the book.
Yeah.
Then the Germans developed different stuff. They started adding moly and cobalt to stainless steels. VG10 traces its history all the way back to a German stainless with cobalt. You can learn about that in there. And then the modern exciting development is S30V, which was crucible steel started getting more involved in the knife industry because people wanted 154 cm, which was a crucible product. And so there were metallurgists and sales guys that worked for Crucible that got more and more into knives until they decided, let's go all the way in and let's make a knife steel just for the knife industry. And they went and talked to different knife makers, most prominently Chris Reeve. And I've got a big piece on Chris Reeve in there.
Yeah.
From an interview he did in Blade magazine years ago. I pulled a lot of quotes from that. So it feels like stealing sometimes, but some of these guys you can't really talk to anymore.
Right.
And so, yeah, S30V, I've got stuff from the metallurgists and from the knife companies that helped develop that. It's a real cool story. I really like, the crossovers between metallurgists and knife companies and knife makers. And S30V is definitely one of them. Another one, like I said, was Kuhnrich with the D3 and D5 and the razors, where he was that guy combined together.
Yeah.
Steel alloying came from a famous scientist, Michael Faraday, and a knife maker guy, who owned a knife company. They were trying to copy Wootz, which was a sword steel.
Yeah.
And they were the first people to add alloying elements to steel. So knives have been in this history since the beginning.
I love the chapter on Wootz also.
Yeah,
The
there's
recreation stuff.
Yeah. If it's about knife steel, it's in this book, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Well, I did not see any surgical steel stuff in there. So
Oh.
that was a big thing in the 80s.
Yeah.
well, it's all 420.
Damn it.
Spoiler alert.
I'm going to start making some historically correct 420. Stainless steel knives.
Right. Extremely rich history. Tons of different information from old to the later section, right? Has tons of modern steel stuff in it. which is probably closer to a lot of the website stuff that you've done, right, Laren? With like some kind of, it's not fair to call it snippet, but it's like a whole bunch of touch on a whole bunch of different modern steels.
Yeah, I think the modern section kind of moves faster.
Yeah.
And maybe some people wanted more there. There's a couple reasons why there's a little bit less in some of the modern stuff. One is that where in the early period, a lot more stuff is like early discoveries and these individual, rogue guys, trying new things. Where today it's corporations with employees, right?
Yeah.
And so, the people story is not always there. And sometimes this is really difficult to get. So another disappointment I had in writing the book was I was trying to get more of the story of Crucible developing powder metallurgy steel in the late 60s. And I found a guy who was still alive who had worked on it.
Yeah.
And I cold called people with the same name of about the right age, and I found him.
Wow.
And I was like, I can't believe I found you. Like, let's start talking. I told him about the book. He's like, well, call me next Saturday at 9 a.m. and we can talk. I'm like, great, I'll be there. So I got a recording program on my phone, which I hadn't done with the other people. I just typed while I talked, but I'm like, this one's important. I don't know if I'll get him on the phone again. So I got a recording program for my phone, and I call him the morning of, and I'm like, hey, just to let you know, I'm recording you. And he's like, you're recording me? I'm like, yeah, what's the big deal? And he's like, I sent you an email with all the information. And I'm like, I never gave you an email address. And he's like, I sent it to such and such email. And I'm like, how did you make up this email? I never gave you an email.
Right.
and he's like, well, if you think you need to record me, all the information's out there. I'm like, I need the story behind the people. And he's like, forget it. We're not talking.
Wow.
And he ends it. And I was like, how did I screw this up?
Oh, postmortem of the interview gone wrong.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I got sidetracked. I don't remember what I was saying before I got there.
We were just
Story
talking
of CPM.
Yeah, the modern stuff, and there's just less of the people story for the most part.
Also, because I lived the recent stuff, it's actually less interesting to me.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure.
I remember that coming out 5 years ago. Who cares? So
Yep.
But it's still in there. But yeah, a lot of the steels are more developed by committee. I can find the patent, and it's 5 people, working for Uddeholm in Sweden. And it's more difficult to contact the people in Sweden. So I include their stories where I can find them. I try to track down the knife companies that used the different steels first. But, S30V comes out and 20 companies used it around the same time. So, I mean, it's not like Bob Loveless introducing 154CM in the early 70s. It's a new product and everybody was excited about it and they all used it.
Yeah.
So the story changes.
Yep. One of the things I wondered about before when we had you on, Laren, I don't think we talked about this. We talk a bunch on the show about how the whole knife industry has gotten it feels so huge.
Yeah.
Right. In recent times or recent years. But I have to think that even with the knife industry in this explosive state, from a growth perspective, what's your best guess of the total steel industry? What portion of it is knife stuff?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know, Crucible and Niagara are the biggest suppliers of high-end knife steel.
Yeah.
If we're ignoring the bigger production stuff, which would really skew the answer. So all that 420 being made for these inexpensive knives. Crucible is the number one producer of high-end knife steel. And they told me, we were freaking out because somebody was denigrating Niagara, saying that they're a junk company and don't buy from them. And Crucible's like, yeah, we don't like that happening, but this is a very tiny portion
Yeah.
of our business.
Right.
You know, and it wasn't like it doesn't matter, but it was like, if we keep a big picture perspective, like things aren't going to come crumbling down.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways it's more expensive because all of these little knife makers and individual knife companies need attention and have difficulties, and it's expensive to handle all those people,
Right.
you know, as opposed to making tens of thousands of pounds for one customer. And if they have an issue, that's fine. You know, they're 10% of our business. So
Yeah. 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 That would be a really interesting percentage number to have. I guess you'd have to get down to the nitty gritty of defining what exactly makes knife steel, right?
And if we have to contact like Chinese and Japanese companies, and then like the faceless, so ATI is a big steel company that makes a bunch of like 420 and 420 HC. You know, you can't talk to anyone at those companies. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Interesting that it feels like this huge industry, and I don't know. I think it's probably a drop in the bucket compared to other consumers of steel, obviously, right? Whether it's automotive or construction or whatever.
Hard to see out of our own bubble, though.
It sure is.
it's important to me.
Yeah.
You know, and that's part of where this book came from is, you know, I grew up around this industry. You know, I learned a lot from knife makers. You know, Ed Shemp, he's a knife maker up in Washington.
Yep.
He, you know, he hangs out at Spyderco booths at a lot of shows, and some YouTubers interviewed him, and he ended up talking about me and my dad the whole interview. I'm like, you know, Ed, they were asking about you. So, you know, I've been given so many knives, you know, from Hall of Fame guys. You know, we went on a big road trip, me and my dad, a couple of them with Bill Ruppel.
Yeah.
He gave me a slip joint knife. I think it was worth like, you know, over $1,000 back then, and probably who knows how much more now.
Right.
You know, he just gave it to me. You know, and we went on a big old road trip, hours and hours and hours in the truck. You know, and so people in the knife industry are very important to me. And, you know, I've been given so much. I've learned so much. It hurts me a little bit. You know, I did a YouTube video called Do Knife Makers Know How to Heat Treat? And, you know, and I covered a range of beginners up to more experienced people. And people commented like, you know, you're so condescending to them. And I'm like, I thought I was being respectful. You know, sometimes I forget, like, I think I get automatic cred from my dad being a knife maker. Like,
Yeah.
I like knife makers. So,
Right.
you know,
Right.
there are guys that work in steel that say knife makers are all dummies and we hate dealing with them all the time. You know, and I'm like, that's not me. You know?
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, one knife maker in particular, I was talking to him, I'm like, oh, I love your knives. And he pointed out that video, and he's like, well, you're out there telling people that knife makers don't know how to heat treat. And I'm like, well, I'm an expert in heat treating. Of course I know more than them about heat treating.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I love knife makers. I love knife companies. I love the knife industry. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's why I wrote the book. So.
Yeah. Well, I think we've said repeatedly, fabulous book, tons of really, really interesting info, and for anyone, right? Whether it's somebody who likes to sit down and blast through it or take it section by section, right? And actually digest what's there. That was probably the biggest challenge I had personally, was it's just like I don't know, it's like a super high concentration of info. Right.
Like drinking from a fire hose.
Exactly. Which is awesome.
Well,
and it's also wow, this is a lot.
I was expecting, and not to be, you know, hurtful or anything, I was expecting a more dry book, a more technical, and there's a ton of technical information in there, but there's also just so much good history that it's a good read for anyone.
Yep.
I mean, anyone that loves knives should get the book, and I don't know, it's wonderful, wonderfully done.
Yeah,
Yeah, anywhere I could, we haven't said this yet, but everywhere I could, I had firsthand accounts from the metallurgists or the knife makers. History books are so boring because the history writers do all the talking.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you want to hear the story about a knife maker who developed something, then have him tell it. you know, when you just say like, oh, such and such man reintroduced this in 1970 X, like who cares?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, the book is 500 pages, but like you said, there's lots and lots of pictures. And every chapter is, I don't know, like 10 pages, including the pictures. So, you know, there's no fluff in here. I know I write these massive books or huge articles, but I'm actually a pretty tight writer. So to toot my own horn.
Yeah. So, well, that's why I was saying there's our digestible chunks, right?
Yeah.
You could sit down and read 10 pages of this and then come back to it and continue the story or the evolution of the information, right? And in 10 pages, you got 30 pages worth of information, right? You did a really nice job of having it condensed. And that's the way I approached it was, here's a chunk. I'm going to read a chapter, stew on it, think on it a little bit, make some notes and go back.
Yeah, you can definitely do some skipping. Some stuff builds on other things, but you know, if you see like, oh, I want to read the chapter on Wayne Goddard, then just skip there and read it. And I do need to give a shout out to the magazine writers and the book history writers, because I used a lot of them. There's a million references in the back. I put a bunch in bold that were my favorites. So like magazine articles with interviews and stuff like that. So, you know, I try to do lots of my own original research, calling people, finding the like original statements from people. But I was heavily reliant on Blade Magazine, Knife World. And I didn't feel bad about that. Like, who is going back and finding 1982 January Blade magazines and just reading them? Nobody. So, you know, this is an ad for all those old magazines. You can go and pay for like back issues of them. So if you find a story you're interested in and there's a bold magazine article in the back, go get it from Blade Magazine or Knife Magazine or whatever.
Yeah.
And read the whole thing. So, I mean, they did some of the work back then that we can't recreate now. You know, the
also,
people are gone.
Where else were you going to get the information? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, the references section is fantastic. I mean, deep, right? Awesome.
Yeah, there's some good stuff in there.
Yeah, I guess I didn't even make it to the actual index. That's really cool that there's an index so you can go look by a maker or a material or... Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, also you should buy a hardcover and the PDF, and then you can search inside the PDF. So. And buy multiple copies for all your friends. You know, Valentine's is coming up.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a significant other.
Right.
Wives love this book, I bet.
Yeah, wives are going crazy for the story of Knife Steel.
Yep. There you go. You need to relight the fire. This will get it done.
Very romantic book.
All right. Well, Aaron, thanks for taking the time to talk with us. And we just blasted 2 hours and barely scratched the surface of what's here. So.
Oh, yeah. I'm not worried about spoiling the book. That's impossible.
Nobody's going to skip the book for that. All right. Well, thanks again for taking the time to chat with us. We appreciate it. Maybe we've talked about a couple ideas about having you come back.
Yeah, metallurgy minutes, or I don't know what we've talked about. But whatever you want to do, bring me on. So.
Yep, Knife Mythbusters. We did one of those already. There's probably a couple more we could do. So yeah, we'll definitely talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll do it right away, Laren.
Yeah, I'll see you in another couple years.
All right. Well, big thanks to our friends on Patreon that keep us rolling. I know you keep Laren's thing going too, right? Knife Steel Nerds, strong Patreon support. So go check out Laren's page, knifesteelnerds.com. I got that right?
Yeah, support both. So I got knifesteelnerds.com. The Patreon is patreon.com/knifesteelnerds. I have the YouTube channel, Knife Steel Nerds, the Instagram, Knife Steel Nerds. Probably other things I'm forgetting. So I do a million things all the time. You know, I got stuff in the furnace tempering right now. I'm always studying something else.
Yeah. And check out the Innovators YouTube video. It's fun.
Oh, yeah. I got to go watch that Bethlehem video. Yep. And just imagine my children like whining and fighting in the background.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks to Bob and Suze for your support, our friends on Patreon, the guys over at Giant Mouse, and George, the OG helper of Mark of the Maker. We appreciate you, man, for sticking with us for so long. And I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, at Crine Knives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram at birchtreeblades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram, at msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram, at markofthemaker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.